Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Pam Thomas. This is Online with the CMC, Reading the Past, Reading Historical Handwriting, and our metadata cataloger, Kat Anderberg, is going to tell you all about how to read historical handwriting. She will take questions at the end. Go ahead, Kat. Kat, if you're talking, I can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Maybe go into your settings and make sure you've got the correct microphone selected.
Can you hear me now?
I can. Yay.
Wonderful.
Okay, you might want to go back
Yep.
to the, okay, sorry. All right, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Today's topic is reading the past, reading historical handwriting. My name is Kat Anderberg, and I am the Metadata Cataloger here at the Cataloging Maintenance Center. Today, I'll walk you through parts of a manuscript I recently transcribed and cataloged for New Lenox Public Library and share some tips that helped me along the way. At the end, I will share my list of resources. This document is titled History of Methodism in New Lenox, written in 1899 by Fred S. Haven, and is shared by the New Lenox Public Library. This document posed a number of challenges. There are ink spots on the paper, and the ink didn't flow smoothly from the pen, so the letters came out uneven. Some pages of the scan are more clear and sharp than others, and the perennial speed bump of all historical manuscript transcription, there are letters that are written differently than we might expect. Some notes on how I do manuscript transcription. I don't have the physical manuscript with me since I work with digitized materials, so I like to print out copies to work from instead of transcribing from the screen. I also prefer to transcribe manuscripts by hand and then type up the transcription from my own notes, which are in my own handwriting and therefore easier for me to read and type up. If I try to type a transcription directly from the original manuscript, I tend to lose my place on the page due to the unfamiliar handwriting. Of course, this just comes down to personal preference. If you prefer typing your notes directly, by all means, do what works best for you. My first step when facing a manuscript like this is to skim through it, paying attention to any words that jump out. At this point, I am not looking to read or decipher every word, but to familiarize myself with the style of handwriting. Here, I've highlighted some words that stood out to me during this first skim through. The title itself, the date, July AD 1899, community, the personal names, Abraham Francis, Thomas Francis, John Casper, and William Gauger, and the place name, Plainfield, Illinois. These personal names were familiar to me because of other documents I've worked with from the New Lenox Public Library, and they gave me a good starting point when deciphering certain letters. Once I've finished this first skim through, I'll start making my transcription. During this first transcription pass, I'll leave underlined blank spots in my transcription for any words that I'm unsure of. Sometimes context will help me decipher these, and sometimes I'll need to revisit these words after I've completed the rest of the transcription and am more familiar with the way the scribe writes certain letters. Here you can see where I left blanks and question marks during my initial pass through, and those missing words and letters were filled in on subsequent passes through as I became more accustomed to reading the scribe's handwriting. The lowercase letter e frequently tripped me up throughout this manuscript. In these examples, see how the letter is not formed with a small loop, as we might expect to see it today, but with two peaks. To my eye, this letter looks more like how I would write the lowercase r in script, but we can tell from the context of the surrounding letters that this letter makes much more sense as e than r. This is not an uncommon way of writing the letter e in the 19th century. Another letter that took me some time to identify was the leading lowercase r, shown here in comparison to the lowercase r in the middle of a word. A compounding factor was the use of the letter in the word rods, the usage of which I was unfamiliar with. Upon later research, I learned that a rod is a unit of measurement of 16.5 survey feet, which makes sense in the context here, a few rods west. This word took me a long time to decipher. The context didn't help as much as it could have. A few rods west of the blank between New Lenox and Frankfurt. I left this word untranscribed for several passes through the document, and it was one of the final words that I deciphered. I did know that the final letter was an E, as we've gone over previously, and for a long time, I thought the first letter was a capital A, but I couldn't figure out what the middle letter was. The likeliest possibilities were an N or a U, but neither of those made sense. After careful examination, I came to the conclusion that what I thought was a capital A and adjacent ink spot was actually an L, whose loop slightly intersected with the adjoining letter I, making this phrase a few rods west of the line, which makes sense in context. Another word that gave me a lot of trouble was this word. The preceding words, Rev begs led the, didn't help a lot. In modern vernacular, I wanted to interpret this word as way, but it would have to be gravely misspelled for that to be correct. The first two letters were almost certainly V and A, and from my familiarity with the writer's handwriting, I knew the final letter was most likely N. However, led the van isn't a very common phrase today, and since I hadn't encountered it before, I was certain that van couldn't be the correct word. Some research later, and I was proven wrong. This usage of van refers to the forefront of a movement or a group of people at the forefront of a movement. I found an example of this usage in a song by Edward Lysett published in 1859, The Man Who Led the Van of Irish Volunteers. Again, this usage makes sense in context and goes to show how a little research about historical use of certain words can make you more confident in transcription. There can also be non-letter symbols in manuscripts. Here is an example of an ampersand used on page 6. This is the only ampersand in the document, and I was very fortunate that the context made its meaning clear. Ampersands can be written many different ways, and while this one is not the most unfamiliar one I've ever seen, it did throw me for a minute when I first encountered it. As I said, this ampersand occurs on page 6 of 7, and it is the only ampersand and non-letter symbol in the document, so I was not expecting to encounter it. One other trick I find helpful is to trace over the letters of a word I'm unsure of. Here is the first instance of the name begs. By this point in the document, I'd familiarized myself with the writer's lowercase e, but just to be sure of the spelling, I took my pen and drew over the letters on my printout, following the original pen strokes. This confirmed that the name was spelled B-E-G-G-S. This trick of tracing over letters can also be helpful if you are fortunate enough to encounter a manuscript that has been cross-written. Cross-writing, sometimes also referred to as cross-hatching, uses less paper, which could be helpful when paper was scarce or if you needed to save on postage. And it could also add privacy to a piece of correspondence, since it does take a little extra effort to read. Cross-writing is when, upon reaching the end of the page, the writer turns the page 90 degrees and writes across the original writing. The first few times you encounter this, it can be helpful to take a colored pen and trace over the words in the direction you're reading. I haven't personally encountered this at the Cataloging Maintenance Center yet, but a previous metadata cataloger did process a collection of Register of Illinois prison records, which includes cross-writing, an example of which is shown here. Here is the page again, this time with red pen traced over the writing in each direction, making the text easier to follow. If you encounter cross-writing frequently enough, you will likely be able to start reading it without tracing, but I find this a very helpful trick when starting out. My sources for today include The History of Methodism in New Lenox, Illinois State Prison, Alton, Volume 3, page 2, How to Decipher Unfamiliar Handwriting, A Short Introduction to Paleography from the Natural History Museum, Tips for Reading Old Handwriting from Ancestry Support, and How to Read Old Handwriting by Judith Batchelor from Who Do You Think You Are magazine. On the call today are Dr. Pamela Thomas, Mary Cornell, Katie Roberts, Kat Anderberg, and Blake Walter.
Thanks, Kat. We don't have any questions yet. Okay, if you are in an environment where you can unmute yourself, you are now allowed that privilege to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can post a question in the box. Forgot to tell you that the slides without the notes are on L2 right now, and we will put the slides with the notes on L2 after the presentation is over. We will also be sending out a recording to the link probably early next week. And Kat will also do a customized transcript on YouTube. Blake asks, is AI/OCR developing any capabilities to automatically scan script? That's funny because we were just talking about that.
I am unfamiliar with any progress in that direction right now.
It would be nice. And okay, D. Fagan says, I have many documents from the 1820s forward. They are written in pencil and are extremely light and therefore difficult to read. Other than scanning and writing over them, is there any way to darken, photocopy and darken?
If you have any kind of photo editing software like Photoshop or something similar, what you can try doing is upping the contrast on those images. That might help. That might make it a bit more clear. It kind of is a case-by-case basis though, but that would be a good starting point.
I think you can you switch the contrast too? Although that might not be helpful in this case. Blake says, have you tried scanning them with a yellow cellophane overlay? Sometimes that darkens light text. Okay. Jennifer says, I was trying to decipher some old German script that is weird letter formation. I found a basic guide on Wikipedia and that helped with occasional letters. And then D. Fagan says, thank you. And then again, thanks, I will try both. Okay. And just a reminder, you know, if these are historical documents and if they're digitized, Kat can do the transcription for you. So just reach out to her. In October, we're going to be doing something a little different. On October 12th, we're doing Stump the CMC. So we want you to give us some of your cataloging struggles, questions, and if you could start sending those to us when you can, so that we can maybe have something to work with at the beginning of the presentation. I just put our group email down there. That would be helpful. And we also have a new evaluation form, and that's on the L2 event. So you just need to kind of scroll down and click on the link. And if you could fill out the evaluation, that would be great. Bethany gave a link, a hyperlink. Germans are putting out some good work like this, and here's an example. And she gave another link. Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, handwriting can be very challenging, and I was the person who was transcribing the prison documents. So those are fun. And I'd never worked with cross-hatching. At least with a computer, you know, you can rotate the view, so that did help too. But like Kat said, you just have to get really familiar with the handwriting, and that it does take time, but it really does help. Does anybody else have any other questions? Again, you can unmute yourself, or you can put a question in the chat box. And if you haven't already, if you could rename yourself, and you should just be able to click on participants and then find your name and hover over your name and click on the ellipses and click rename. If you can just put your first and last names, that really helps when we're reconciling the roster. So whatever your name is in L2, it's helpful if you have the same name here on the Zoom roster. Ashley says, not a question, but New Lenox very much appreciates all of the hard work going into helping us with our collection. You are
Thanks,
welcome.
Ashley. I really love working with your materials.
Bethany says this was helpful. I think very digital, so remembering to go to paper and ink. And Erica says, this was really interesting. What would you say is the most difficult item you have transcribed?
This wasn't here. This was actually when I was an undergraduate taking an archives class. I had a Civil War diary that was very, very faint. And of course, I was 20 or 21 years old and very nervous about touching it and working with it. So that was probably the most difficult. The letters were very faint, and it was, I think, my second time working with a historical document, a historical manuscript. So.
Okay, D. Fagan says, I'm guilty of expressing different versions of letters depending on their position in a word, as you pointed out in your example. Is this common in older writing? I think it's common in modern writing. I mean,
I would agree. I think it's just a natural part of handwriting. Certainly in historical handwriting, you see things like the long S in the middle of words. And other letters. And then also, if you look at modern handwriting, especially script, this is less common in print handwriting. People will just naturally change their letters to what's easiest to write depending on placement.
And I think just the writing, and especially like in the 1800s, was different than it is now, or at least that's what I found. That was like the biggest curve for me to learn, just that learning curve of I mean, you see these symbols on the page and you're like, what is this even saying? You just kind of have to keep looking at it and trying to figure it out. But it's fun. It's a challenge. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Again, you can unmute yourself if you're in a quieter environment, or you can keep posting questions in the chat. Linda says handwriting in English by non-native speakers can be a challenge too. Yes. Or even English speaking people who don't spell well can be challenging. Holly asks, do you have any tips for reading writing that is incredibly small?
My best tip would be magnifying glass or scanning and blowing it up.
That's what I would do.
Just
I'd
embiggen it.
Yep. But sometimes you can't, sometimes you make it too big, it can get really blurry. So you kind of have to mess around with that. But Jennifer says spelling in the olden days was also very subjective. Right.
Spelling wasn't standardized until
Right.
just the past couple centuries. And then, of course, depending on the level of literacy.
Right. And all of that makes it more challenging, right? D. Fagan says, we have recently had an individual submit a handwritten note and a photograph asking us to verify that it was written by an individual from whom we have many letters and photographs. Have you any suggestions for matching handwriting samples to other samples?
That I do not. If you watch, CSI or anything, you know that matching handwriting is its own specialty, and there's not really something you can do with any degree of certainty unless you have a lot of experience in it. My best suggestions would be trying to match shapes of letters, but that's not my area of expertise.
Okay. Liz says, do you have a resource that identifies various shorthand symbols such as the ampersand used in the 18th and 19th centuries?
That How to Decipher Unfamiliar Handwriting Short Guide to Paleography from the Natural History Museum, that had a few examples. I don't have one that is exhaustive. You kind of have to poke around in some different places.
Okay. Amanda says, could you go back to the resources slide? There you go. And again, these slides are on L2. And then we'll put the slides with the notes on in a little bit. Do we have any other questions? Just several people saying thank you. Melissa says, do you have good resources for identifying vocabulary changes over time, like your example of van?
I don't have one source for that. What I do is I just research online. I think for the use of van, I ended up Googling led the van and poking around, and same with the word rods. I'm not aware of any one book or source that has all of that in one place. I suppose a really good dictionary might track historical usage, like the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, is pretty good about that. But mostly I just research, especially, yeah, the phrase it shows up in.
And Melissa says that's a good tip to use the term in a phrase, and thanks. Did you use ancestry.com as well to look up any of the personal names?
Not while doing this transcription, but I
Okay.
did, all of these names showed up in previous materials that I'd worked on for New Linux, and so I had looked them up
Okay.
then. So I didn't need to look them up this time.
Right. But that's another resource if you've got access to it. For personal names, at least. Not necessary for Led the Van. Okay, any other questions? Again, you can unmute yourself or post it in the chat box. And just a reminder, next month, September 14th, we'll be presenting a quest to assemble, cataloging board games. And Mary Cornell will be presenting that. And we've got all of our online with the CMCs in, oh, thanks, Mary put the link in there, through May. And then we have all of our cataloging courses that we teach on Moodle in L2 as well. And all of our online with the CMCs are the second Tuesday from 10 to 11, except for the February one. That one will be the third Thursday. Did I say Tuesday? I meant Thursday, sorry. But you can look us up in L2. Okay, you're welcome, Lynn. All right, looks like we don't have any other questions, so I'm going to stop the recording and just want to thank everybody for attending. And like I said, we'll send the link out